"Stay away from that barn," the mountain man said, his voice low and final, "if you value your life." Willa Finch heard the warning clearly. What she didn't yet understand was that it was not meant for her protection alone. She arrived in Cedar Hollow on the last stage of autumn, when the aspens had already shed their gold and the wind cut straight through wool. The stagecoach driver barely waited for her to step down before snapping the reins and leaving her standing in a cloud of dust, one carpetbag at her feet and $3 sewn into the lining of her coat. The valley was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, almost watchful. A handful of buildings huddled together beneath Widow's Peak, their roofs bowed under the threat of coming snow. People paused when they saw her, not because a stranger was unusual, but because she was impossible to overlook. Willa Finch was 27 years old and nearly 300 pounds. Her body announced her presence before her voice ever could. She stood there in sensible boots and a plain brown dress, shoulders squared as if bracing for impact, already accustomed to the looks that slid across her like thrown stones. The school board chairman cleared his throat. "Miss Finch, you'll be teaching 13 children, one room, stove's temperamental, pay is modest." "I didn't come for comfort," Willa said. Her voice was steady, educated, unmistakably Eastern. "I came to work." That much was true. What she did not say was that she had come to disappear. In Boston, everyone had known her name by the end. The fat school teacher who broke a gentleman's nose, the woman who didn't understand her place, the headmaster's son had cornered her in a supply closet, his breath hot with entitlement, his words sharper than any blade, built like a brood mare, lucky to be noticed. Grateful was what she should have been. Instead, she'd reached for the nearest thing and swung. The dictionary had been heavy, satisfying, final. The scandal had cost her everything: her position, her reputation, any chance of remaining where people whispered behind gloved hands. Cedar Hollow did not whisper. It stared. But it did not ask questions, and that was mercy enough. The schoolhouse sat at the edge of town, a one-room cabin pressed up against the mountain shadow. Willa threw herself into her work with the same stubborn intensity that had carried her through years of quiet cruelty. She taught children who arrived barefoot, children who smelled of wood smoke and sheep, children who listened when she read, because she made stories sound alive. For the first time in years, no one laughed. Then, 3 weeks after her arrival, the door opened and silence fell like a dropped plate. He filled the doorway as if it had been built too small by mistake. 6'5" at least, shoulders broad as a barn beam, his coat patched and worn smooth by weather. A scar pulled one side of his face tight, and his eyes were the gray of an oncoming storm. Magnus Vale. The children stiffened. One girl crossed herself. Someone whispered his name like a prayer or a curse. Willa felt it then. Not fear exactly, but the unmistakable awareness of a man who had survived things that did not leave room for softness. He said nothing as he stacked firewood by the stove. When he was done, he turned to her. "You're the teacher." "Yes," Willa said. "And you are—" "Matter of fact doesn't require introductions." His gaze swept over her, not lingering, not judging, measuring. "You'll do fine here." Relief flickered, brief and dangerous. Then his expression hardened. "But stay off the mountain after dark," he said, "and don't go near my barn." "Your barn?" Willa asked. "The old mining shack, red X on the door." His jaw tightened. There's something in there that doesn't forgive mistakes." He left before she could ask another question, the door closing behind him with quiet certainty. That night, as the wind howled down from Widow's Peak and the valley lived up to its name, Willa lay awake in her narrow bed and thought about warnings. She had spent her life obeying them, and she had spent her life paying the price anyway. Somewhere on the mountain, something unseen shifted in the dark, and the valley held its breath. It is easy to issue warnings. It is harder to ask why they are needed. When fear is offered as protection, one must decide whether to accept it or to seek the truth it hides. Before we continue, let me ask you, where are you listening from today? And if this story touches you, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs it. Now, let's get back to the story. Winter announced itself early in Cedar Hollow. By the second week of November, frost crept along the inside of the schoolhouse windows like pale veins, and Willa learned the precise temperament of the stove, how much wood it demanded, how quickly it sulked, how easily it punished inattention with bitter cold. She learned, too, the rhythms of the town, who brought eggs in exchange for lessons, who watched from a distance, who never came near at all. She did not miss the stares. She noticed their absence. No one mocked her size. No one whispered insults loud enough to hear. The frontier had its own brutal honesty. If you worked, you stayed. If you didn't, you left. Her body was simply another fact, like the weather or the mountain. Still, there were moments, quiet, unguarded ones, when old shame stirred, when a chair creaked beneath her and she froze, waiting for laughter that never came, when she caught her reflection in the schoolhouse glass, wide and solid and utterly unlike the women in illustrated novels. She reminded herself why she was here, not to be desired, not to be forgiven, but to teach. Magnus Vale returned every few days with firewood, always alone, always silent. He never stayed to drink coffee, never lingered more than necessary, yet his presence reshaped the room. The children behaved better when he was near, sitting straighter, voices lower, as if instinct warned them not to test a force of nature. Willa watched him when she thought no one noticed. He moved with restraint, the way men did who understood violence intimately and chose not to indulge it. His hands were scarred. His clothes smelled faintly of pine sap and smoke. Once, when a boy dropped a slate and flinched as it shattered, Magnus crouched and handed him a new one without comment. It was the gentlest thing Willa had ever seen done without kindness being claimed. "Why does he live alone?" she asked Mrs. Calder, one of the mothers, as they walked back toward town after lessons. Mrs. Calder hesitated. "Because he's already buried the people he loved." That was all she said. The warning about the barn should have ended Willa's curiosity. Instead, it sharpened it. She noticed the trail climbing toward Widow's Peak, narrow and half-hidden by brush. She noticed the way Magnus's gaze followed her whenever she wandered too close to its beginning. She noticed one morning deep paw prints half buried in frost, round, heavy, unmistakably feline. A cougar, she thought. Up here? The realization settled uneasily in her chest. On Saturday, when the schoolhouse stood empty and the town quieted under low clouds, Willa packed bread, cheese, and an old book wrapped in cloth. She did not tell herself she was going to the barn. She told herself she was going for a walk. The mountain had its own silence, thicker than the valleys. Snow muffled sound. Trees stood like witnesses. When she reached the structure marked with a red X, her breath fogged hard in her throat. The barn looked less like a place of danger than of neglect. Sagging boards, rusted hinges, a chain looped tight around the door, and something breathing inside. Fear rose, immediate and sharp, but beneath it lay something else. Recognition, not of the beast, but of confinement. She thought of the supply closet in Boston, of walls too close, of air stolen by panic and hands that did not ask. When the golden eye appeared at the gap between boards, Willa did not scream. She knelt. "I won't hurt you," she whispered, unsure whether she was speaking to the animal or to the memory of herself. "I promise." The growl faded. The breathing slowed. That was when Willa understood something that would change the course of all their lives. The creature in the barn was not merely dangerous. She was afraid. Over the next days, Willa returned, not recklessly, not foolishly, but with intention. She sat outside the barn and read aloud, her voice steady despite the cold. She brought food and left it where the cougar could reach without exposure. She did not force herself closer than invited. She learned the animal's rhythms, learned that the blind eye made her turn her head to listen, learned that patience mattered more than courage, and slowly, impossibly, the beast responded. Magnus discovered her there on the 5th day. His fury was not loud. That made it worse. "I told you to stay away," he said, gripping her arm hard enough to bruise. "That animal has killed." "So have men," Willa replied, not pulling away. "We don't lock all of them in barns." The words shocked them both. Magnus released her as if burned. "You don't understand what you're risking." "I understand exactly what I'm risking," Willa said quietly. "I've done it my whole life. The difference is, this time, it matters." He stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. Not the weight, not the woman society dismissed, but the steel beneath. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw. "She won't let me near her. I saved her life, and she still won't eat for me." "Then let me try," Willa said. "Let me show her what mercy feels like." Magnus turned away, shoulders rigid, as if holding something back. "1 week," he said at last. "If she doesn't improve, I end it." Willa nodded. She understood impossible odds. She had lived inside them. Compassion is often mistaken for weakness. Yet it is the rarest form of courage, to step toward what frightens us, not to conquer it, but to understand it. Ask yourself this. When faced with a wounded soul the world has labeled dangerous or unworthy, would you choose safety or mercy? The mountain did not welcome visitors. Willa learned this quickly on the first morning Magnus allowed her to come alone. Snow had fallen in the night, light but persistent, softening the trail just enough to make each step uncertain. The climb from the schoolhouse to the barn was not long, but it was steep, and the cold gnawed through wool as if testing resolve. She walked anyway. Her breath came in white plumes. Her legs burned. More than once she stopped, braced against a pine trunk, waiting for her pulse to slow. There was no one to see her struggle, no one to mock the way her body demanded pauses the world rarely allowed her. In that solitude, she felt something unfamiliar. Freedom! The barn emerged through the trees like a relic left behind by a different life. The red X was stark against the weathered wood. Willa paused before approaching, listening. Inside, she heard the low shift of weight, the scrape of claw against plank. "I'm here," she said softly, announcing herself as she would to a skittish child. It's Willa." She sat where she always did, back against the wall, book open in her lap. The cold seeped through her skirts, but she ignored it. Words mattered more than comfort. They always had. She read of moors and mist, of a woman who refused to be diminished by cruelty, of quiet endurance, mistaken for meekness. Her voice carried into the dark, steady and warm, threading humanity into a place that had known only pain. Minutes stretched, then an hour. Finally, the breathing inside the barn eased. The growl faded into silence. On the third day, Magnus followed her partway up the trail. He did not announce himself. He simply appeared behind her, tall and immovable as the trees. She startled despite herself. "You shouldn't be doing this alone," he said. "I'm not alone," Willa replied, surprising them both. "Not really?" He studied her face, red from cold, eyes bright with purpose. "You're not built for this mountain." She met his gaze. Neither was she. He did not argue. Instead, he walked ahead, breaking trail through the snow. He did not offer his arm. He did not slow his pace unnecessarily. He simply made the path possible. They did not speak until they reached the barn. Magnus stopped 10 paces back, rifle slung but ready. Willa took her place by the wall, unpacked the meat she'd brought, and slid it through the gap. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the cougar moved. The sound was massive and precise. When the animal's nose appeared at the opening, Magnus's breath caught despite himself. Up close, the damage was unmistakable. The ruined eye, the scars pulled tight by bad healing, a body built for power, reduced by fear and starvation. "She's blind on the left," Willa murmured, "so I sit on her right, so she can see me." Magnus stared. "You notice that?" "She noticed I noticed," Willa said. The cougar took the meat, slowly, deliberately. When she retreated, the sound she made was not a growl. It was a low, vibrating rumble. Magnus turned away, jaw clenched hard enough to ache. The days settled into a rhythm. Willa climbed the mountain. She read. She sang when her voice felt strong enough to carry. She spoke to the cougar as she would to a frightened student, without condescension, without demand. Magnus watched from a distance, then closer, then not at all hiding his presence. At night, when Willa returned to the schoolhouse, her body aching and her fingers numb, she found small kindnesses waiting, extra firewood stacked neatly by the door, a repaired hinge. Once, a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, still warm. She did not ask who left them. On the 6th day, a storm swept down from the peak without warning. Snow fell thick and blinding, the wind screaming through the trees like a living thing. Willa was halfway down the trail when the world vanished around her. She lost the path. Panic flared, old and familiar. She forced it down, breathing through the tightness in her chest. She did what she taught her students to do when fear threatened to take over. She stopped. She thought. She listened. Footsteps broke through the storm. Magnus emerged from the white snow clinging to his coat, eyes fierce with something dangerously close to fear. He reached her in 3 strides and gripped her shoulders, grounding her. "I told you not to come up alone in weather like this." "You didn't tell me storms would hunt," she said, trying for levity and failing. He pulled off his coat and wrapped it around her without asking. His hands were warm, solid. "Lean on me," he said. It was not a request. She did. They walked down together, her weight no burden to him, his presence a shield against the storm. When they reached the schoolhouse, he stoked the fire and stood watching until color returned to her face. "Thank you," Willa said quietly. Magnus nodded. You bring warmth where there wasn't any before, he said, almost to himself. Outside, high on the mountain, the blind cougar lifted her head and listened to the wind. Something in the valley had changed. Journeys are not always measured in miles. Sometimes they are the slow crossing from fear to trust, from isolation to shared warmth. And sometimes the path forward is made simply by someone walking ahead, clearing the way. The first time Magnus asked Willa to come to his cabin, it was not framed as an invitation. You shouldn't be climbing the mountain every day, he said, eyes fixed on a loose board he was repairing at the schoolhouse. Snow's getting deeper. You're exhausted. I'm managing, Willa replied. He finally looked at her, really looked, her chapped hands, the faint limp she tried to hide, the stubborn set of her shoulders. My place is closer to the barn, he said. You can rest there, eat, warm up. The cabin sat higher on the mountain, tucked into a fold of rock and trees that broke the wind. It was smaller than Willa expected. One main room, a narrow sleeping alcove, a rough-hewn table scarred by years of use. Everything in it had a purpose. Nothing existed for decoration alone. The fire was already lit. Magnus hung her coat by the door and set a kettle on the stove without asking what she wanted. The gesture was unremarkable, almost brusque, yet Willa felt something loosen in her chest. No one had prepared a space for her in a very long time. Sit, he said, nodding to a sturdy chair reinforced with extra slats. He had reinforced it before she arrived. She noticed. She did not comment. She drank the broth he poured, heat spreading through her in slow, welcome waves. Outside, wind clawed at the cabin walls, but inside there was only the crackle of fire and the quiet presence of another human being who did not require her to shrink. Magnus busied himself with small tasks, sharpening a knife, mending a strap. He spoke little, but when he did, it was with care. You read to her like she's human, he said eventually. Because she is, Willa replied, just not the kind people like. He glanced at her. You've had practice being disliked. Yes, she said, and surviving it. That night, when the storm worsened, Magnus insisted she stay. He laid out blankets on the floor, then paused, frowning, and disappeared into the alcove. When he returned, he carried the narrow bed frame and set it by the fire. I'll sleep out there, he said, gesturing to the main room. That's not necessary, Willa began. It is to me. He did not touch her. He did not linger. He simply made space. Over the following weeks, the cabin became part of Willa's world, not as refuge alone, but as rhythm. She helped where she could, sweeping, mending, learning how to split kindling without exhausting herself. Magnus showed her how to angle the blade, how to let weight and gravity do the work. Strength isn't forcing it, he said. It's knowing where to stand. At night, they shared meals by the fire, sometimes silence, sometimes stories. Willa spoke of books and classrooms, of children who learned to read and discovered new selves in the process. Magnus spoke, haltingly, of the army, of the mountains, of the woman he had once loved and buried beneath a cairn of stones no one else ever visited. I didn't save her, he said once, staring into the fire. Willa did not rush to contradict him. You loved her, she said. That matters. He shook his head. Love doesn't stop death. No, Willa agreed softly, but it stops us from becoming less than human afterward. The cougar, Duchess, Willa now called her without hesitation, grew stronger. Her coat regained its luster. Her appetite returned. She no longer flinched at Magnus's presence, though she watched him with measured caution. One evening, Magnus approached the barn while Willa stood beside him. Duchess did not retreat. "She trusts you," Magnus said. "She trusts that I won't leave," Willa replied. "There's a difference." The first time Duchess followed Willa back to the cabin, it was at a distance, a shadow among shadows. Magnus noticed immediately, tension coiling in his stance. "She won't come closer," Willa said calmly. "She's guarding." "From what?" Willa looked at him. "From being alone again." Winter deepened. Snow piled high against the cabin walls. Cedar Hollow became a cluster of lights in a sea of white. Inside the cabin, life settled into something resembling peace. Magnus carved a second chair to match the reinforced one. He built shelves for Willa's books. He listened when she read aloud, pretending not to, hands stilled, breath measured to the cadence of her voice. One night, as the fire burned low, Willa laughed, truly laughed, at something small and foolish. The sound startled them both. Magnus looked at her as if she were a revelation. "You don't laugh much." "I didn't have reason," she said. "You do now." The words were simple. They landed like a promise. Outside, Duchess lay beneath the stars, her single golden eye open, vigilant. Inside, two wounded people learned the shape of a life that did not require apology. Healing is rarely dramatic. It is built from small, deliberate acts. A chair strengthened before it is needed. A bed offered without expectation. A silence shared without fear. This is how broken places become homes. Winter teaches people what they are willing to lose. By January, Cedar Hollow had become a pocket of survival carved out of snow and silence. Roads vanished. Letters arrived rarely, when at all. The outside world felt distant enough to be unreal, and that, Willa would later understand, was exactly what made danger so quiet when it finally came. The first sign was the look on Magnus's face when he returned from town one evening. He did not remove his coat. He did not sit. "There were men asking about you," he said. Willa's hand stilled around her mug. "Asking what?" "Your name, where you came from, whether you were alone." The old fear surged, fast and familiar. Boston rose in her mind like a ghost she had never quite buried. The supply closet, the blood, the way power had closed ranks against her. "I was careful," she said. "I didn't leave anything behind." "You don't have to," Magnus replied. "Men like that bring the past with them." She told him everything then, not just the incident, the years leading up to it, the quiet humiliations, the careful obedience that never bought safety, the moment she realized compliance was just another kind of erasure. "I didn't regret it," she said when she finished. "I regret that I had to." Magnus listened without interruption. When she was done, he stood and went to the door, staring out at the dark as if weighing something vast and irreversible. "They won't stop," he said finally. "People with money and wounded pride never do." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying this place protects us only as long as no one looks too closely." That night, Duchess returned with blood on her whiskers and did not leave the edge of the clearing. Magnus noticed. He always did. "She senses it," he murmured. "Threat." Days later, the threat took shape. A letter arrived with the stage driver, creased, official, heavy with implication. Willa recognized the hand before she read the name. Cornelius Hartwell. The words were cold, precise, merciless. accusations dressed as civility, a demand for restitution, the promise of law invoked not for justice, but for control. Magnus read it once, then again. "They'll come," he said, "and they won't care who they hurt to make an example of you." Willa felt the weight of the cabin around her, the shelves, the fire, the life they had built plank by plank. "Then we leave." Magnus shook his head. "Running teaches them they're right. Staying teaches them they can destroy us." Silence stretched. In it lived a question neither wanted to speak. "What are you willing to give up?" Magnus asked quietly. "To keep this?" Willa thought of the children at the schoolhouse, of Duchess, no longer caged, but not fully free, of Magnus, who had already buried one life and refused to bury another. "I've spent my whole life giving things up so other people could be comfortable," she said. "I won't do it again." "And if the price is blood?" Magnus asked. Willa met his gaze, steady and unflinching. "Then we decide whose. We all believe we are good until the storm tests our roots. Sacrifice is easy when it costs us little. But when love demands risk, real, irreversible risk, we learn who we are willing to become. If you stood where they stood, with safety behind you and danger ahead, would you choose the quiet of surrender or the peril of standing your ground?" They arrived at noon because men like Cornelius Hartwell believed daylight made them righteous. The sound reached the cabin first, the crunch of hooves on frozen ground, the jingle of tack, the unmistakable cadence of purpose. Duchess lifted her head from where she lay near the tree line, her single golden eye narrowing. A low rumble rolled from her chest, not a growl, but a warning, ancient and precise. Magnus was already on his feet. He checked his rifle with the calm of a man who had done this before and hoped never to do it again. Willa stood beside him, Clara bundled against her chest, the child's warmth a fierce anchor. "They'll try words first," Magnus said. "Then they'll try law. When that fails, they'll try force." Willa nodded. "And if they take me?" "They won't." Hartwell rode ahead of the others, his coat too fine for the cold, his posture practiced and smug. Reginald followed, pale and tight-lipped, the old injury to his nose a permanent testament he had never forgiven. 2 hired men flanked them, hands resting too easily near their guns. Hartwell dismounted with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Miss Finch," he said, "I see you've made yourself comfortable." "This is my home," Willa replied. Magnus stepped forward, placing himself just slightly in front of her, not to hide her, to make a line. "You're trespassing," he said. Hartwell chuckled. "You mountain types always confuse ownership with isolation." He produced papers, crisp and authoritative. "I have filed a claim. Assault, flight, damages. You will return with us, Miss Finch, or this becomes much uglier than it needs to be." Reginald spoke then, his voice brittle. "You ruined my prospects." Willa looked at him, really looked, and felt only a distant sadness. "You ruined your own," she said. "I survived." Hartwell's smile hardened. "Seize her!" The men moved. Duchess did not wait. She came out of the trees like a living force, snow exploding beneath her paws. The first man went down without a sound, the impact driving the breath from his body. The second fired wildly. The shot went wide, and Magnus answered with a single, controlled crack that shattered the man's shoulder and his will to continue. Reginald screamed and bolted, slipping in the snow, dignity forgotten. Hartwell froze where he stood, staring as Duchess circled him, her ruined eye gleaming, her body coiled with intent. "Call her off," he whispered, terror stripping his authority bare. Magnus did not raise his voice. "You will leave, you will withdraw your claims, and you will tell anyone who asks that Willa Finch is dead." "And if I don't?" Magnus met his eyes. "Then you will learn what real consequences are." Duchess stepped closer. The lesson was clear. Hartwell nodded, frantic. "Agreed." They left as they had come, less certain, less whole. When the valley fell quiet again, Willa's knees gave out. Magnus caught her, holding her until the shaking stopped. Duchess approached and laid her massive head against Willa's leg, a living shield. "That's strength," Magnus said softly. "Not the gun, not the fear. This, true strength, is not found in domination. It is found in the choice to stand between what we love and what would destroy it, even when the cost is high, even when the outcome is uncertain." Spring returned to Cedar Hollow the way it always did, quietly, without ceremony. Snow retreated inch by inch, revealing earth dark with promise. The mountain loosened its grip, streams swelling with meltwater, birds testing the air with cautious song. Life did not rush back. It eased in, as if asking permission. The schoolhouse filled again with children shedding coats and boots, their laughter sharper after months of silence. Willa stood at the blackboard, chalk dust on her fingers, her voice steady as she guided them through words that opened doors she herself had once needed. She did not tell them about Hartwell, about how close everything had come to ending. Some lessons were not meant to frighten. They were meant to prepare. Magnus repaired the fence, replaced broken steps, planted early vegetables in the narrow patch of soil that caught the most sun. He moved with the same quiet purpose as always, but something in him had settled. The tension that once lived permanently between his shoulders had eased, replaced by vigilance rather than expectation of loss. Duchess ranged wider now. She was no longer confined to the barn, no longer half-starved, half-wild. She moved through the trees like a guardian spirit, visible only when she wished to be. Sometimes she vanished for days. Sometimes she returned with offerings left carefully at the edge of the clearing. She always came back. One evening, as the fire burned low and the sky deepened to indigo, Willa sat beside Magnus on the cabin steps. The valley spread below them, no longer silent, but alive with the soft sounds of renewal. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Willa asked. Magnus considered the question carefully. "Once," he said. "All the time." He glanced at her. "Not anymore." She rested her head against his shoulder. "I used to believe home was something you earned by being acceptable. And now? Now I think home is where you don't have to explain why you're worth keeping." Magnus's arm tightened around her. He did not answer with words. He did not need to. In the trees, Duchess watched them, her golden eye reflecting firelight. Somewhere beyond the ridge lay danger, law, judgment. The world that believed it had the right to decide who belonged. But here, in this fragile pocket of peace, they had chosen one another, and that choice, Willa knew, would have to be made again and again. Home is not a place on a map, nor a promise that danger will never come. Home is the courage to stand still when the world demands you run, and the grace to build warmth in the shadow of uncertainty. Love does not end the threat. It gives us something worth defending. Every story that lingers does so because it touches something human and unfinished. Willa's journey is not only about a mountain or a scarred man or a blind cougar who chose trust over fear. It is about the quiet bravery it takes to remain gentle in a world that rewards cruelty, about the strength required to claim space when you have been told your whole life that you do not deserve it. If this story found you in a quiet room or on a long road or at the end of a hard day, know this: stories travel farther than we ever can. They cross borders, languages, and histories to remind us that compassion is not weakness, and that love, true love, is an act of defiance. Wherever you're listening from, whatever weight you carry, you are part of this circle now. And if you still believe that kindness can survive in harsh places, then stay with me. The next story will be waiting for you.